read everything as a political act. Read all architecture as a political act. And where is that there? Ian McDougall, founding director of ARM. Done a bit of teaching in my time, so for that, adjunct professor at RMIT and at University of Adelaide. I think the tricky thing in that is it's got a range of meanings. Kind of current meaning is like a driving idea, but I don't think that was what its original meaning. It sounds like it's slightly pejorative now, and particularly if its meaning comes with the connotation that it's a predetermined idea that you bring to every project. I'm not sure that we would think we do have a predetermined idea. We may well have a process or a strategic roadmap that we would bring to a project rather than an all-embracing idea that then comes into every project. There would be, for instance, an interest in the architecture's capacity to carry narrative and carry sort of cultural ideas would be maybe considered a parti, but it doesn't manifest itself in any one way. It's not like a palette, nor is it like the strict minimalized classicism of Mies or something like that. We would probably think about an approach, a way of working, and that way of working may well be about its capacity to carry ideas or also the capacity to challenge standard architectural tropes. That's, I guess, that would be part of our approach as well. The starting point is actually winning the project, but we'll leave that for now. I guess we do try and find propositions within the history of the project. So that is trying to analyse the cultural position of the client or the context of the project. If you take the client, the program, and all the accoutrements which constitute the things that a project carries, within that there's historical issues, there's precedents, there's typologies, all of those things then we research. History of the site can reveal quite interesting things. In the Monash project, the Chancellery project, the history of the university and the cultural trajectory of the university, the fact that it was set up as a university, not a sandstone university, it was set up as a university of industry where science and technology and doing, research turns into doing by reading a number of both the ordinary history, the official history, the history of the people who started it, and then also their sort of their personal histories or some of their correspondence about their proclamations about what the university would be. We would start with that. You know, it might be that we would start with, in working in performing arts centres, we might start with the history of theatre, find things within that. For instance, the project we're working on at the moment, where we're looking at the history of the carnival. So theatre has one line, but it also has, particularly in Australia, performance art starts with travelling carnivals. You know, the gold rush brings famous singers to tents in the Ballarat goldfields. So there's a history there. So those sorts of ideas then become part of an aesthetic narrative and also a sort of typological narrative that we would exploit. It's all a mystery. So you start to make things like that, or, you know, like in the Recital Hall or the MTC, where we started with the idea of it. The original brief hall was one building, and the building would be an arts centre, and there would be a foyer. And we started with the idea that no, it's an urban institution or institutions, two institutions that have different histories, and they have different, the rarefied nature of acoustic classical music versus the rough and tumble of repertory theatre. So they would have different clothes, they would look different, and they would actually feel different. But they'd also be side by side, like they were two shops in a street. So that's why they sit on the street like they do, rather than it be an edifice. When you think of the performing arts centres that were built after the Festival of Britain or the Lincoln Centre in New York, where they were art forts, it would be the opposite to an art fort. So once you've got an angle on what's the sort of general narrative, you start to give form to those things. And sometimes the forms work and sometimes they don't. So the idea of the recital hall as a container for the music, taking that as a protective coating for the music that's inside, that sort of trajectory becomes a form. But in that, if you go back to that idea of the parti, there is a sort of predilection to certain things. There's a line in our work which kind of explores the cave. So spaces are created as that sort of interior space that is like a magic cave, a wondrous cave, a wondrous interior, rather than neutral or modern. They're actually much more elaborated and articulated. And then sometimes, the path to them is a maze. So unlike the proposition of there being a field of space, and the field then carries containers. So contemporary theatres, which we probably find quite boring, are often articulated as big processional, and the characterization of the path, and then also the journey begins and ends in that contained cave. The process is quite revelationary, because as you explore the cultural expression of the ideas, those ideas, you can sometimes change tack, and things will be revealed that confront your own proposition about it, and think, oh, that's interesting. I'm apparently not allowed to do that. I better do it. Transgression is a big thing. Transgressing your own preconceived ideas, things that we take as being correctness. There's a tendency to be incorrect as often as possible. Diagramming is really a method of explaining it to people. I don't think we use diagrams as a design tool. Pragmatically, the way that things work is there's the sketching out at the same time as there's a 3D modeling. It's part of a kit of things that you can do. So the diagram is more to do with explaining what we're doing to the people who are commissioning the work. For instance, in the Monash Chancellery, the colonnade, the stoa, we have this idea about that space, sort of public apron to a very secure executive fortress, and that sort of public apron, then we explain it in terms of the word stoa. It has a scholastic tradition and an academic tradition, but at the same time, the diagram of it as we show it is a colonnade, a sort of processional where you can stand and expound your thesis. But then it also brings with it other cultural attachments, which we then can flip over. So the diagram, often just to explain planning, organisation, or typology, or a spatial thing, then yes, we will use diagram. Communicating the ideas is important, and we use precedent and cartoons. Maybe that's a diagram, but it's not really. It's illustrative and optional. Like, here's one way to deal with the tent. Here's another way to deal with the tent. Here's the tent as a curtain. Here's the tent as a sort of marquee. Here's a boxing tent. So we would show them as different, both precedents from history or from contemporary culture, or as three-dimensional cartoons about, okay, this is a direction we can take. So yeah, that's the method of communication. I don't think we look for singularity, and I think it's the thing that somehow might be opposed to the idea of universality or universally correct. The propositions are fielded on the idea that it could be wrong, or human folly, or whatever. The potential courage of making something versus its innate failure to do what you want it to do. Maybe that's a shorthand way of saying, no, there's no singularity. The National Museum, where what his concept for it was those multiple strands that come together and then get tied into a knot that never becomes one thing. Mutual empathy of different things that can exist together. When I was teaching in Adelaide, once a year we would bring a whole lot of students over to Melbourne. We took them to Kerry Lyons, or Lyon Architects, Swanson Academic Building, and a number of the students said, what's the ordering device between all of the stuff that's going on there and all of the other stuff that's going on there, which is completely different? You're there. There ain't no ordering device. That juxtaposition, the mutual, that can exist and that can exist together. There's no larger patrician going, no, this is the order that must be. We would tend not to try and create a holistic unity without contradiction and without counterpoint. What is post-rationalisation? Do you mean somebody who doesn't have an idea, and then someone says, was your idea this? And they go, yeah, it was. Yeah, that's bad form. People see things in a project that are unintended, then there's no requirement to censor that or correct that. In many of our projects, there's an exegesis of ideas, which stands as the sort of inspiring narrative or the running description of the process, if I can put it simply. And we try and, we get a dialogue going where it's genuinely interesting. As architects, we're kind of more interested in the classical tradition or the Renaissance tradition and the Baroque tradition and the 19th century tradition, where buildings carried distinct narratives, where they were propositional about stuff and contentious about the stuff, particularly in the 19th century, when you get these sort of arguments about the Gothic and the classical and vernacular and or the whole of the discussion which underpinned contemporary culture now that was kind of smoothed over in modernism. Those discussions are really interesting because they are about how buildings connect with their communities. You have to work that out. You have to work that out. Dissatisfaction is forever. I don't mean overall. I mean aspects of the resolution that fail, that don't do what you wanted them to do. You have to decide that. It's kind of you as an architect and a designer finding your place in the field of ideas of architecture and finding whose work you understand or have a empathy for, and then working from them and also working away from them. So you're not constantly copying someone who you like. You're working through and drawing from those lessons, a skill of decision making, then finding your own narrative. So there isn't a methodology that you can tick box and say that's how you know. It's a mystery. Well, contemporary buildings in many instances need to be read for what they are, not what people say about them. And in that way, it often is what isn't done. But if you look at contemporary culture, which is elaborative, decorative, loud, energetic, and sort of effusive, I'm like, why is it that architects are going down a line where everything's reduced and grey? I don't get it. Why are we censorious rather than celebratory? Why is there one line rather than diverse cultural lines? Where's the experimentation? So why isn't it being experimented? So it's either because it's become commodified, so you read that and think, okay, I need to read a building as to why it's commodified. Why is the craft disappearing? And architects will say, oh, it's because, the way that buildings are delivered now. That's not true. I mean, contemporary technology, CAD/CAM construction, it's endless what you can do. And I mean, we try and get that into our work within normal budgets. But yeah, you ask, so you can read, the Lions buildings and go, this is about, the experimentation about too much is never enough. Or Peter Corrigan's line, more ideas, less refinement. And a lot of other work, contemporary work, it's the opposite. And you have to read, well, why is that? We try and look for joy. Where's the joy in the work? The short answer is read everything as a political act. Read all architecture as a political act. And where is that then? That's the necessary consciousness that allows you to develop an architecture that attempts to communicate and embed itself within wherever it sits. I have some advice. You have to study architectural history. You have to know architectural history. You have to look at it not from a social scientist point of view or an art historian's point of view, from a designer's point of view. How does Borromini deal with a building that's very small but it wants to be big? How do they turn the corner? Look at it like a designer. Look at the 19th century work and wonder how they, not as a line of so-called development, but individually how each architect has dealt with particular things, and learn how you do that now in your play, how we work.